Greetings, everybody. I want to welcome you here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. As you can see, my display is down. I'm cleaning and reorganizing, so everything's down while I do it. So all we have back here is me and the Elephant Man. There he is, just peeking behind my head. Anyways, tonight we're doing metal. For those of you who haven't seen metal before, basically it's a show I do every second week in which I talk about a metal band, either past or present. Present being anything that happened in the last 10 years, past being anything that happened 10 years or greater. So it's the past turn this time, and so we are doing this band, Whitesnake. I've got a few of their albums. I used to have more, but that was mostly in vinyl, but now mostly CDs. So anyways, for those of you who are wondering what it is we do, so I'm just going to basically go over the career of Whitesnake a bit. Not going to go into great depth here because I don't know as much about them as a lot of other people do. I have followed their career since most of those albums were out, and some of the later stuff I've gotten a little bit more into as well. So anyways, Whitesnake is basically a blues hard rock band that eventually became more of a glam metal band, and actually are quite a bit more heavy now than they were even then. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about them. So this is a band, and put my notes up here so I can see them. So this is the band that was formed in London in 1978 from the remnants of Deep Purple. Deep Purple had broken up at this point, and lead vocalist for Deep Purple, one of the two main singers at the time, David Coverdale, decided that he was going to go solo, but he didn't want to really go 100% solo, so he was going to have a band called Whitesnake as a backup band. And they actually took on a bit of a life of their own. So when they started out, they were kind of a hard rock, tiny bit of heavy metal here, more of a hard rock bluesy band. They released an EP in 1978 called Snakebite, in which, it was kind of a heavy bluesy kind of hard rock band. And David Coverdale wanted to stay away from that hard rock sound, and so he was more leaning towards doing the bluesy thing. Initially, this band also had a bit of soul music to their feeling too. I think he wanted to incorporate this soul and funk, so they weren't just labeled as a hard rock band. He didn't want to be labeled as a hard rock band, so he incorporated elements of soul and rock in their music as well. The first band, or the inaugural band, included David Coverdale, Mick Moody, and Bernie Marsden on guitars, Neil Murray on bass, David Duck Dowell on drums, and Brian Johnson, and not the Brian Johnson, of course, but Brian Johnson on keyboards, a different Brian Johnson, of course. So, they were initially technically called David Coverdale and Whitesnake. He didn't really want that. He just wanted it to be called Whitesnake, but the label at the time decided that he was kind of the known commodity, and they wanted to have his name out there so people would know who he is, so that's why they kind of went that way. Martin Birch was the producer of the EP, and Johnson then was replaced on keyboards by Pete Sully for the EP. So Johnson was the initial keyboardist, and then Pete Sully came and kind of replaced him and did the EP for them. After that, the band became known as Whitesnake after the EP. They basically took on that Whitesnake label, and they had this kind of a album. So their initial what do you call it? Initial logo, I guess, was a Whitesnake on all of their albums at the beginning. So anyways, at this point in time, the band became known as Whitesnake, like I said. And then in July of that year, in '78, the first album, Trouble, came out, which all of the stuff that Pete Pete had done as the keyboardist, Pete Sully had done as the keyboardist, was redone and replaced by John Lord, because Coverdale wanted Lord in the band, so he talked him into it, and then once he came in, they replaced all that stuff, and so John Lord became the keyboardist on Whitesnake album, replacing Pete Sully. After the album released, they did this tour with a lot. After the album was released, they did this tour, which kind of started out, and they did touring around the UK, and then the last concert they did was at the Hammersmith Odeon during that tour, and they were supposed to be touring Japan coming up, and the Japanese did not want them to just come over there without having a live album, so they took that Hammersmith Odeon performance, recorded as a live album, and released it, and then they toured Japan after that. So that's mostly what happened initially with them. Then on their second album, which is called Love Hunter, for those of you who haven't seen this album, I don't own it, but it's the one with the naked woman riding a serpent. Now, I use the word serpent as opposed to snake because to me a snake looks like this with a head like that. This was more of a dragon-like head, horns and everything sticking up, so I think of that as more of a serpent. So anyways, at this point, they decided to, Martin Birch produced the album, and then after that they decided to replace Dowell with Ian Pace. So now you got 3 members of Deep Purple in the band, and it's pretty much, he was replaced pretty much for that reason, although they said that he wasn't available and stuff, all kinds of nonsense, but that's what really happened in my opinion. The album did get some criticism, for the Love Hunter album did get some criticism because of these sexist lyrics and the album cover itself, which they had a sticker on to try it, or they would put chainmail on her rear end to keep her rear end from showing on the album. So yeah, that was back in the day when that kind of thing really was a big deal. And the next album, Ready and Willing, hit the Billboard charts. They toured with Jethro Tull at that point, and with AC/DC towards the end of that year. Their fourth album was again produced by Martin Birch at the Ringo Starling kind of studios in Ascot, Berkshire, in 1981. So and the album went to number 2 on the gold and got gold status. So this was their first kind of really big album for them. Then at that point they toured with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, and after about 5 months they released the next album. Again, this is their 5th album at this point in time. Birch was replaced because he had been ill by Guy Bidman, and that didn't really work out as well as they hoped it would. And then Moody quit, and the band, because they weren't making any money and they couldn't understand where this money was going. And then at that point they confronted the kind of manager of the band, but Coverdale wasn't there, and during the meeting the manager told them that they were all fired. Marsden, not Moody because he was already gone, but Pace, Murray, and Marsden were all fired. That Coverdale had a desire to take over the band and run it his way, and so that pretty much is the way it was from there. From that point on, he was kind of in charge of everything, and he was going to do whatever he wanted to do. Kind of not dissimilar to another member of Deep Purple called Ritchie Blackmore, who kind of did the same thing with Rainbow. So very similar. There's a lot of similarities here. You got guys that want to be in control, and to be honest, they were the big names, so they should have been in control. But why have this image of a band if you're going to just be a solo person? Just call yourself your name and have a band then to back up. Then nobody has anything to say. They're just hired musicians. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case here. So, their 6th album came out with Eddie Kramer this time. He replaced the guy on the last album, Guy Bidman and Bidmead or Bidman. I think it's Bidmead. Most of the material was kind of written by Coverdale, and at this point in time, Mel Galley was now in the band. And after this album, Kramer was replaced for the next album by Birch. They brought Martin Birch back in to do the big album for them. I'm just going to flip to my notes. Yeah, so at this point in time, in comes Galley. He's helping write most of the music along with Coverdale, but his arm gets injured, cannot play for the band in '84, so they replaced him with somebody. Well, I can't remember who it was. Anyway, I think it was John Sykes. Yeah, they replaced him with John Sykes, and at this point in time, Lord left to go back for the Deep Purple Mark II lineup. And then Powell and Murray also left the band at this point to at the end of the tour. So at this point, then they decided to do the next album. So he decided at this point he wanted to make a change. He didn't want to be a kind of bluesy hard rock band anymore. He took on this kind of glam metal persona, and their music changed to be more of a metal sound. Not horrific change, but very different from what they had been doing up to this point. So this was this album, which is the one that I've made a video about, which kind of lost touch with this album a bit, but I'm trying to give it a little more feel than I have been lately. So anyways, this was their big album too. This one sold about 8 million copies, and they did really well with it. Anyways, they basically toured with that album, which then featured a big, wholly different lineup. You got John Sykes here. He's the main guitar player here, I think, and Vanderberg. So, but the problem with Adrian Vanderberg is he had injured his hand, so he couldn't play much on the album and the one that came after it, and that they had to get somebody else. So at any point after the album was done, everybody in the band that was playing on the album at that time were all fired and let go. Ainsley Dunsbar, Don Airey, all gone, and Vanderberg was the only one that they kept, and he did add Vivian Campbell and Tommy Aldridge and Rudy Sarzo to tour with this, and then they had more of this glam metal band image, and that's how they proceeded for the next little while. I think it was always almost up to 1990. They kept changing a lot of musicians through this period of time. I'm not going to get into all the changes. It's just too much, and to be honest with you, if you listen to their albums, there's not a great deal of change in the sound between the 87 and the 90, or 90, I think it was 90 or 91 album, I can't remember, but we're going to get into the albums in a minute anyways, and so we'll go over that a little bit more. Yeah, so, and he was changing musicians all the time because he wanted this or he wanted that, and he was in charge, and you know, it kind of is, like I said, very reminiscent of Richie Blackmore, who just kept kicking people in and out of the band because he wanted a different sound, or he wanted to be this, or he wanted to be that. And he actually was quite jealous of this band because they had that hit album, and that's what he wanted as well. So anyways, we're going to go over the albums a bit, and then I'll also talk a little bit more about the lineups of each album, instead of trying to, when you're writing notes about the history of the band, it's very difficult to keep this guy came and that guy. I mean, it just gets confusing. So anyways, the first album that they did was called Trouble. This is a rocking album, pretty hard. A little bit of metal sound here, but I wouldn't say that to me, it's a hard rock blues album. That's what it is. Coverdale's voice is great on this album, I think. And it's got this kind of hard, funky feel to some of the songs on here as well. And they do a cover of Day Tripper, which is very funky. This is and they used a talk box on this particular track as well. Really, really interesting use of the talk box for a kind of classic song. And I find the drums are pretty good and predominant here as well on this album. Then you go to the second, and so the band at this point in time is the initial band, the opening band or the founding band. David Coverdale on vocals, Mick Moody on guitars, Marsden on guitars. You got Neil Murray on bass. You got Dave Duck Dowler, I'm not sure how you want to pronounce that, on drums, and then eventually John Lord took over the keyboard part before the album was released and replaced all the stuff that had been done by the previous keyboardist. So the second album is, to me, very similar in a lot of ways, but there's a kind of visual attempt to make it more mainstreamish. I don't think it is more mainstreamish. I think it's pretty similar to the first album, but because the cover has this giant serpent and a naked girl riding this serpent with her back to the person looking. Yeah, so they attempted to do that, but it's a very similar bluesy rock album. A couple of tracks are a little more soulful here. Medicine Man is a hard rocking, catchy as hell track. That's probably my favorite track on this album. And the album is a little bit more hard rock overall than the initial album, but not that much. Next one, Ready and Willing, released in May of 1980. Coverdale shows why he is one of the best hard rock vocalists at this point in time. He's got that really smooth sounding, real catchy voice. Very distinctive, I think. Almost a Robert Plant sound to his voice. Ready, which is kind of not coincidental since he did that stuff with Coverdale and Page. Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, I think. Ready and Willing, kind of a hard rocker. Lots of funky sound here. There's a couple tracks on here that are ballad-like. This one has more ballad-like tracks on it than the predecessors. It's a fair bit bluesy sounding, this album, but I don't think it's as bluesy as those two albums. The track Black and Blue, that is kind of got that southern soul sound to it, you know. This was the one track that I think really shows a little bit more of that bluesy side of them than a lot of their other tracks. And the keyboards on this album are a lot more predominant, I find. And maybe it's just me, but it sounds like John Lord has really come to his own here on this particular album. Not that he wasn't with Deep Purple and that, but maybe it wasn't as dominant on Whitesnake as it could have been, but I think it was a little bit more on this album. And of course you have a change in the lineup slightly because Ian Pace comes in and replaces Dave Dowler on the drums. And so for the next, I think, 4 albums, yeah, so Ready and Willing, Come Get It, Saint and Sinner, and Slide It In all have the exact same lineup. So about 4 albums, that's about as steady as you can get, right? So really the first 6 albums, the only person, they changed the keyboardist before the initial album, and they changed the drummer after the second album, but pretty much it's the same lineup for about 6 albums. The next album up, I actually own, which is this one. This was my first Whitesnake album. I love this album. It's probably my favorite still. I think that happens a lot when you get into a band and you really, the initial album really usually, if you like it, has more of an impact on you than a lot of their other albums. But I like this one a lot. There are some kind of, where is it? I can't see it. Yeah, Girl. I love that song, but it's kind of, there's a couple of kind of childish tunes on it that they sound a little bit on the amateurish side, but overall this is a great album. I love the album cover. This is one of my favorite of their album covers as well. So Come and Get It is the album that we're talking about. Hard rock with kind of catchy beats. Some funky parts here, but not overly. Coverdale is exceptionally strong on this album as well. I think his voice is distinctive here. And the music's toned down just a little bit. Toned down in the sense that you don't have that filler at the back, which is usually caused by a second guitar. And there are 2 guitarists on this, but it just isn't as predominant as you get on a lot of their other albums. Yeah, so this album cover, of course, I already said is my favorite, and it's got a little bit of a funky beat to it, to a couple of the tunes on here. Really good album anyways. It came out in April of '81. The next album up, Saint and Sinner. I do not own that one, although I thought I had it, but I must have gotten rid of it, or I must have had it in album. There's a couple I had in album that I don't have in CD as well. So this is a up-tempo heavy rocker. Again, Coverdale strong, smooth vocals here. Some really good solos on this album as well. Crying in the Rain, this is the original version of the song, which is a little bit more laid back. Toned down, I guess. It's a fairly lengthy song, but it's toned down a little bit from the version you get in a couple albums from now. Lots of funky, hard, rocking album here. Some heavy guitar riffs, bits, and a few solos too. So this is a more heavier album than its predecessor as well. Then you get to the Slide It In album, which at this point, I think the Slide It In album, when it came out, was probably their best album at this point. It's the last kind of album with the original Whitesnake guys. It's got a bit more of a metal sound to it than some of the other albums before it, but it still has some heavy, catchy riffing here and a little bit of that old bluesy stuff that they were doing earlier on. And this album sold really well. The track. Oh, there was one track I want to talk about. Yeah, so the title track of this album, that's what I want to talk about. Really got some really heavy bluesy stuff on it. So that is probably the most predominant bluesy track of this album, and is probably this is kind of the end of that bluesy era. And so then they move forward from this point. So at this point in time, he has a falling out, or basically replaces everybody. Everybody's gone except for Murray. He kept Murray, and he adds John Sykes, Ainsley Dunsbar, and Don Airey playing the keyboards, of course, to the next album, which I think at this point in time, it's this one. This is their biggest album, commercially anyways. Very kind of commercial sounding, very kind, and this was actually the last album, Slide It In, was the last album with their original logo, which featured the snake on it, and you'll see that with this logo as well on this album. This one is the first one with this kind of white snake, almost like a US thing in the middle there with a coin, and it's almost like a BTO thing, really. That's what it always reminds me of. So this is the new logo, appears first on this album. It's a much more metal-like sounding album, very commercial sounding, much more commercial than any of their previous stuff, and almost glam. I think you could argue that this is a glam metal album, and you wouldn't be out of whack. But I think it's heavier than a lot of glam albums, and it does have a little bit more of that bluesy sound than some normal ones. The metal sounds on here are really good, and the solos are killer. John Sykes knocks it out of the park here. Now, I know that Vanderberg was supposed to do that, but injury to his hand caused him to kind of be replaced on this next album. He couldn't do it. So they brought in Steve Vai to do the next album. So Slip of the Tongue, which is the next album, released in January of '89, is a very glam metal album, more so than its predecessor, even more commercial sounding. The guitar parts are very metal sounding. Coverdale's voice is deeper on this album, I think, than its predecessor as well. And there's a kind of a similar, it's a similar album to '87, but just a little bit more of a metal sound. You also have Steve Vai doing most of the guitar work on this album because Vanderberg had that injury to his hand, although he did help write a lot of the songs as well. And then of course there's a lot of auxiliary people on this album that are doing little bits and pieces throughout, but I'm not going to list all of them. That's not the function of this particular show. At any rate, pretty solid album. I think it actually might be a better album than '87. It stood up better anyways. That's my personal feeling. Then there's a gap. He decides to go on hiatus. No more music. Went on for about 8 years. I think he wanted to get out of the music scene. David Coverdale we're talking about. I think he just felt like that the whole music scene was kind of negative, and he didn't like the feel of it and didn't really want to do anything for a while, and so he just broke away and spent time with his kid and stuff, and came back in 97, March 97. They released Restless Heart, featuring Vanderburg now playing more on this album than he did, and he barely did anything on the Slip of the Tongue because of his hand, but here he's playing a lot of the stuff here. Then you got Guy Pratt as well, Denny Carmassi on drums, and Brett Tuggle on keyboards as well. Still a lot of that metal sound on this album, not crazy, but more like it still has a lot of that. There's still that kind of commercial sound here, and yeah, so I don't find there a great deal of difference between this and Slip of the Tongue, except for Slip of the Tongue is a better album. That's my opinion. And the 87 album, they're both better albums than this one. But Restless Heart is not a bad album. Then you go to their next album, which again, another hiatus, which went on for about 11 years. Again, the same kind of issues. Didn't want to make an album. They just did some touring. They started back in 2002 and were touring all over the place with different people and doing different things. And then he decided that they should make an album. And the album is called Good. It's Good to Be Bad, released in 2008. Some heavy songs here, lots of heavy. It's a pretty heavy album, I think. Coverdale sounds more raspy on this album than on anything I'd seen from him prior to this. Summer Rain is a more subdued melody track, a little bit different than what they normally did. And then there's some kind of that distorted guitar parts that you get on this particular album that I wasn't finding as much on the previous album. I'm not really sure what that is. That may be just the guitar style of the current guitar player, Red Beach. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy track. Best Year. That's the track I like the best. I think it's a heavier track. So on this, it features Coverdale, Doug Aldrich, who's now kind of replaced Vanderburg and Galley and Moody and those guys as the music kind of guy. John Sykes, yeah. He's the guy, he's the guitar player that's working with Coverdale at this point, writing the music to his lyrics, and they're writing almost all the songs together. Red Beach is also on guitar, Tim Drury on keyboards, Uriah Duffy on bass, and Chris Fassler, or Frazier. It's Chris Frazier, sorry. Chris Frazier on drums. Sorry about that, my eyes are kind of sore tonight. I'm not really seeing things too clearly. So then so that album was pretty good. Then they released one about 3 years later called Forevermore, a little more bluesy, kind of a little bit more back towards their original sound, but still pretty heavy. But it has that commercial sound as well. I think the vocals on this particular album are a little bit better than the predecessor. He seems to have, whatever was his issue on that last album, it could have been the album itself, or it might have been his own vocals, but I think it's much better on this album. Better than the previous two, Restless Heart and Good from the Bad. This features Coverdale, Aldrich, Beach, Mike Devon now playing bass, and Brian Tichy, who I believe played with, Christ, I can't quite remember the name of the band. It's a big band. It's just, anyways, he's the drummer. Then you have there's another little 4-year gap, but this is normal at this period in time for bands. They're doing albums every 4 or 5 years, a lot of them. So he does an album in 2015, which is about 4 years after the Forevermore. It's called the Purple Album for a reason. All these are covers from the Mark III and Mark IV era of Deep Purple, when he was the lead vocalist, David Coverdale, that is. Heavy tracks, almost metal-like, this album. More metal-like than I think any of its predecessors. Coverdale, Beach, Hoekstra. Is it Joel Hoekstra? I'm not sure if that's Hoekstra or Hoekstra. I'm not sure. Anyways, he's one of the two guitarists with Beach here. And you got Devin again on bass, and in comes Tommy Aldridge, who was with them a while back as well, on the drums. The last album that they've currently done, which came out about 5 years ago now, 2019, their 13th studio album, called Flesh and Blood, featuring Coverdale, Beach, Hoekstra, Devin, and Aldridge. And then you have Michel Lupi on keyboards. I believe he's a Italian. Is it Lupi? It's Lupi. Michel Lupi. I believe he's an Italian keyboardist. I'm not familiar with him that well, but I think that's what he is. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you will anyways. So this is the very metal tracks here. This is a heavy album, maybe their heaviest in their history. Coverdale's vocals are metal-like here, and actually suits him. And they may have gone that route. I'm not sure of this, but it sounds like they may have gone that route because his voice isn't what it was. It's still good, but it's not what it was. It doesn't have that smooth sound anymore. So maybe doing metal, his voice suited it more. That's what it sounds like to me. And yeah, and this is one of their better albums, especially their later albums. I think this may be their best of their later albums. And when I say later, I mean from like 97 on, or actually for 2008. So the like 2015 album, the 2011, 2008. I think this is better than those three albums. And I actually quite like this. This may be among my favorite of their albums now. I've been listening to this one a couple times. It's quite good, Flesh and Blood. So there you have it. That's kind of the album history of Whitesnake and their overall history as well. So this is a band that came from the ashes of Deep Purple and probably would have been a Coverdale solo band, but he didn't want that initially, so they ended up becoming Whitesnake. But in retrospect, he didn't really want anybody else to have control either. So, maybe it was kind of the same thing as, again, I've said this a couple times now, I'm going to say it one more time. It's kind of the same thing as Ritchie Blackmore. He didn't want it just to be called Ritchie Blackmore. He wanted it to be a name. Same with Coverdale. He didn't want it to be called David Coverdale. He wanted a name, but they still wanted to have 100% control. It's a little bit different. But at any rate, that's my take on Whitesnake. Not a band that I've followed much over recent years. Kind of gotten away from them. But I do like this last album that they put out 3 or 4 years ago. I wish they'd do something like that again. That would be good. And that's probably the most metal of their albums. So for me, they were a metal band primarily from the 87 album on. So the first 6 albums. More of a hard rock blues band. Still a good band. And, like every band, they have some really good albums and they have some stinkers, Not terrible stinkers, but, albums that really haven't been kept up to the top of the page in my estimation. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Metal. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe. Just want to let you know that there's a good chance that I'll be changing the format for Metal and Exploring the Prog Universe. As it is right now, they're alternating 1 week, another week, but it doesn't seem to me like enough time to really organize this properly. I feel like I'm pushing it too much, so I may go to like once a month for each of them, so like a 2-week period between them, and that's likely where I'm going to go with this. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make your comments. Remember, I'm not an expert here in anything really, but I do like Whitesnake, and that's what we're here to talk about at the band. So if you know more about them and you want to throw stuff in there that I don't know, that's great, because the more stuff I learn, the better I am with understanding what's going on. So anyways, please hit the notification bell if you want to be notified, and we will see you again next week or possibly the week after for Enter the Prog Universe. Or Metal won't be maybe for like 3 or 4 weeks, but I'm going to try and do this every 2 weeks. If I don't like it, I'll go back to that every week. Anyways, we'll see you then. Take care and have a good night. Goodbye.